Revelation 2151. From the 14th of November 1941. Unusual task. Unusual power. Constant submission of will. An unusual task also requires unusual strength, and in order to be able to receive this strength, the human being's striving must also be unusually great. That is, the human being's will must be willing to fulfill the divine will again and again. A one-time agreement and willingness to serve God is not enough. The human being has to place himself at God's disposal again and again in order to be able to receive strength from God anew. For the human will should become stronger, the human being should consciously seek the connection with God, because only this signifies the separation from the world, which then ensures the receptivity for divine strength. Once the human being declares himself ready, and this would be sufficient for the subsequent task, further development would then also be guaranteed if the human being's will were weak or turned towards God's adversary. And every human being will be exposed to this state at times, and has to be, because the adversary's struggle for the soul also begins, and God does not deny him this either. Then the human being would no longer fight against his enemy but God himself, and this would result in a certain higher development which, however, would no longer be based on free will. Spiritual freedom is only possible when the human being has completely freed himself from the evil power that wants to dominate him. But a detachment from this power is at the same time a union with God. The union with God, however, must be striven for by the being itself. Consequently, the innermost instinct in the human being's heart must long for God, and this longing must become a permanent state, because divine strength flows towards the human being in accordance with the longing. If the human being is to accomplish a task which requires extraordinary strength, he must always be in contact with God. He must always and constantly open his heart so that God's love can communicate itself to him. Thus the will must be constantly active. He must time and again submit himself to God the Lord. He must regard himself as an empty vessel which constantly fills itself with the strength which is absolutely necessary for unusual activity. Unusual activity, however, will always be to wrest from God's adversary the souls that still cling to him. Furthermore, it is unusual work to pass on to fellow human beings what spiritual knowledge the human being receives, who have not yet formed themselves to the point of directly accepting spiritual knowledge. For they will almost always resist if such is brought to them, since the ability to recognize the truth also presupposes a desire for truth. And such people must now be influenced with all love and patience so that they are willing to think through what they have heard. Then it can also be received by them. The transmission of spiritual truths to fellow human beings therefore requires people who are extremely willing to serve and who are driven by the realization of humanity's spiritual need to be helpful. They must place themselves at God's disposal again and again, since such a task can only be accomplished out of innermost impulse. Thus it could never become a mechanical action. Only when the human being is completely absorbed in this task can God work through him in such a way that he makes use of the human being's will, and the latter now has to act in accordance with God's will. This state, however, presupposes deepest love for God and fellow human beings, and thus the will is then constantly active as soon as it is driven by love. But as long as the human being is still struggling and the transformation of his soul is not yet complete, he needs an excessive supply of strength but must also acquire it, that is requested in constant unity with God. A human being must, as it were, live for his fellow human beings and form the bridge from them to God. A person must recognize adversity and try to avert it by shaping himself in such a way as is necessary in order to receive God's strength. And then he must use the allocation of strength for his fellow human beings again, for a person's love, which is expressed in his work for his fellow human beings, is able to transfer much, thus also the allocation of strength from God to them, if his effort is not openly opposed. The will to serve God enables the human being to redeeming activity, and this will be successful if deep love changes his nature into gentleness, patience and peaceableness, for he may only fight with these weapons if victory is to be on his side. But it is a difficult beginning to lead humanity on the same path which earns it the supply of strength from God. For this reason the God-willing human being constantly receives strength in the form of the divine word as soon as he proves himself worthy of it, and the human being's wisdom increases, his will is strengthened, his ability to pass on the divine teachings likewise grows and his love becomes ever deeper, and this is decisive for his earthly task. Only love instills God's love into him to such an extent that he submits himself to God ever more willingly and finally becomes completely absorbed in his will. Amen.